I shall be very brief. You got a very good background on historical and political counters. As a lawyer, my duty is to bring to you certain factors and help you to get a proper interpretation on that, whether any egregious, atrocious criminal acts have been committed or are being committed. In the pre-conflict situation, we all heard and know that extensive preparation were conducted. That's very important for any trained lawyer. A very simple understanding of a criminal element, the word element should be underlined. One has to know that that element, that criminal element, is a set of factors that are needed to be proven in order to determine that Mr. X or Mrs. Y has committed a crime or not. I can cite a bunch of or a list of known and nearly undisputed factors that would enable any reasonable person to conclude that serious criminal acts are being committed in the Tigray region. I'm not saying by who. I will leave that for you. First, the TPLF leadership publicly rejected the legitimacy of the federal government and labeled it unconstitutional. That is the very essence of holding of a politically divergent view, which is a direct legal repercussion in terms of interpreting the then situation and the ongoing one. That very leadership conducted unconstitutional local election and took various subsequent measures which can be easily classified as illegal. The TPLF leadership massively mobilized quote-unquote armed forces. There were large recruitments and extensive trainings were conducted to these quote-unquote armed forces. The same leadership brought the local militia and the so-called special force under one commander. That's very important. And public announcements were made by the regional officials, noting that prominent former military generals, including but not limited to the former chief of staff of Ethiopia, were put in charge of planning and training these local forces. More so, the TPLF leadership conducted several military parades and broadcasted them publicly to the Ethiopian public and the international community at large. there were extensive exchange of saber rattlings. It has a very serious connotation under the laws of war. Massive anti-government media propaganda, making public oral support and allegedly conducting clandestine financial and training supporters to banditry armed groups operating in various localities of the country. And this same leadership made a public call to all nationalities to overthrow the incumbent, the federal government. As if this is not enough, the TPLF leadership attacked the National Defense Forces, in particular to the Northern Command. And it has confiscated heavy artillery, including long-distance hitting rockets and missiles. This has been admitted by the TPLF leadership publicly. These are factors on the ground in the pre-conflict situation. Now I'll take you back to the 101 of Ethiopian criminal law. The set of factors I just outlined help us anyone to classify them at least in 4 categories. Number 1, was there an intent to attack, to overthrow the government, to inflict damage and pains on the citizens? The answer is yes. So one element is fulfilled, what we call it mens rea, the intent of the perpetrator. Number 2, have these acts which I just listed actually occurred? The answer is yes. And the third question is, was there any relationship between what was intended and what has been committed? Again, the answer is yes. The Ethiopian law fully, and I can tell that 100% fully in compliance with the international legal standards. Historians tell us that right after the Second World War, when the Nuremberg Tribunal was established, Ethiopia was very active in that discussion, and it was very simple, handy for Ethiopia to incorporate all those international standards in its domestic law, because the then Penal Code of Ethiopia came right after that event. And Ethiopia has extensive experience in applying those laws domestically without resorting to international fora. All this should not confuse anyone in this hall. The conflict we are talking about is not an international armed conflict. It is 100% a local or a domestic or an internal armed conflict. A friend of me the other day asked me that I'm totally lost and confused how to call this incident, what's happening in Ethiopia. So I gave my own interpretation to that. Probably it's very much helpful to many of us in this hall. For me, it is a large-scale law enforcement operation that led to an armed conflict I'll repeat, this is a large-scale law enforcement operation that led to an armed conflict. Giving that context, now I will take you that what law governs the current situation, circumstance in Ethiopia. As I said, the Ethiopian law is very rich, and it encompasses everything that one could incite from international legal instruments. That said, both the domestic and international legal instruments in regulating war, quote unquote, the following principles need to be always abided by. The combatants should always hit a target of military necessity, period. This is very important. Military necessity, you can hit that military necessity if you are in a war situation. But at the same time, you are obligated to take care of the civilians, which we call it the principle of humanity. The balance between two can easily be clarified by upholding of the third principle, which is called proportionality. Military necessity, humanity, and proportionality. These three concepts are very essential to reach out any reasonable judgment by any lay person. Throughout the pendency of an armed conflict, leaders and combatants are trained or should be trained to know the balance between these three principles. The other utmost important point I need to flag here is every participant in armed conflict has individual responsibility. This is very important to underline. And the other point, I know it has taken some time for the media and for the layperson on the street to discuss about who initiated the war, quote unquote. War initiation is so relevant when the war is conducted between two equals, between two sovereigns. In our case, this question is irrelevant. Why? The incumbent, the local government, is duty-bound to enforce its own law anytime when it wants, but within the framework of the permitted laws. I heard one of the leaders on TV saying that we are acting in self-defense, quote unquote, and even he gave a theory to it. This is anticipatory self-defense. As I said, in fact, the Ethiopian government is criticized because of its neglect of duty for years, not to timely act. That's the way I understand it. Probably would have not reached to the level where we are today. We would have not confused the Ethiopian public and the international community at large by letting this thing to happen. So, extreme and unproportional patience given by the federal government has led us to the situation where we are today. In fact, one could take his good lawyer and challenge the federal government because of its neglect of duty. That law enforcement action should happen any moment. It should not let to happen very late, where the casualties and consequences of this battle has led us to a situation where it is very painful. I could give you a bunch of provisions and articles from the Ethiopian Criminal Code. Probably I can cite some of them for your personal reference. Very clearly articulated in no ambiguous terms. What's happening in the Tigray region can be easily labeled as atrocious criminal acts. The Ethiopian Criminal Code, under Article 248, qualifies what has happened in the Tigray region and what has been committed by the TPLF leadership as treason. Article 248. Article 288. It explains about desertion that has happened. Article 298, insubordination. And mutiny, Article 299. In fact, I encourage you to pick the Ethiopian Criminal Code and look into the full book. It's called Books 3. Crimes committed against the nation, against the state, against humanity, and so forth. Most of those provisions are easily applicable in the situation we are in today. And one quick point, what should happen in the post-conflict situation in terms of exercising post-conflict justice? As a lawyer, no to impunity is my final message. This government has been dragged to unwanted war because it wanted to enforce its own law by saying no to impunity. Yes, we are suffering, it's so painful, but the coming generation should not see anymore such irresponsible acts. That can be done only when accountability and justice can be seen in one prism, and when any self-loving regime finally says no to impunity. This is the way I understand why the federal government of Ethiopia is taking arms to put law and order in a region where lawlessness has prevailed. If no action is taken, it will be worse, not only for Ethiopia, for the entire sub-region and the continent at large.